Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for sexualities and social issues. Today, we're going to talk about sexual relationships. And the thing that's important to know about sexual relationships is that whatever you're doing is weird. We change our minds all the time about how people should be in relationships that are also sexual. We change our minds over the course of time. We change our minds depending on societies. So basically what we're going to do today is talk about what's normal in our current society, what's normal in other societies, and the ways that these things have changed over the course of time. So let's get started. So the first thing for us to consider is the very concept of normal. What is normal? And this is something we ask in sociology a lot. This is one of our favorite things to talk about, norms, normal, and how that changes so rapidly. So for instance, how many sexual partners are normal to have had? Should you have had a lot? Just a few? None at all? If we look at this graph, for instance, you'll notice that the answers change. So in this graph, they were asking people at what number of sexual partners do you think a person becomes too promiscuous? But also, how many is too few? And also, how many have you had? So you'll notice here that the numbers are pretty consistent between men and women, but one thing that's really interesting is that the ideal number of partners pretty much matches up with what these people have already experienced. So it's no coincidence that very often that we think what is normal is what we do, and that's something that's going to come up over and over. So let's get started looking at some other things in terms of what kinds of relationships we think should be sexual. So let's start with casual relationships, because very often in America we go from casual to serious with both our sex and our feelings. So let's start with the phase that is called talking. This is a really interesting thing to sort of ask people about because nobody knows what it means. Everybody has a different definition of talking. So it definitely involves some communication, although these days usually it's texting instead of literally talking out loud. But the question of how serious it is comes up every time. Can you be talking to more than one person at a time? If someone is talking to you, do you care if they're talking to other people as well? Is the talking supposed to be occurring on a regular basis? Is it supposed to get progressively more serious? Is it supposed to be sexual in nature? Honestly, nobody knows. Talking seems to sort of work as a figuring out period, a way of getting to know people. In the olden days, we used to go on dates to get to know people, but these days, there's more talking first. Then you might progress to hooking up. Similarly, nobody knows what this means. The very phrase hooking up can range hugely in terms of physical activities. So it could go anywhere from kissing to sex, anything in the middle, nothing in the middle. And part of the reason that we're so commonly using this phrase, hooking up, is because of its very ambiguity. Sometimes you could use the phrase hooking up to indicate that you went further than you did. Or you could use the phrase hooking up to indicate that you did not go quite as far as maybe you actually did. So the very vagueness can be super useful, especially in terms of protecting your reputation or bolstering your reputation. But if you are hooking up with somebody, a whole new host of questions arises. Are you now dating? Are you monogamous? Can you hook up with several different people at once? Do you expect the person you're hooking up with to be hooking up with other people at once? And the very concept of being friends with benefits is also tricky. Everyone will tell you it doesn't work because someone always catches feelings, and that's not necessarily untrue. That's a very common outcome. In part because humans, no matter how much we want to believe it, have a lot of feelings. So basically, hooking up is very vague, and that leads us to our discussion of hookup culture, which is also very vague. So hookup culture is especially common on college campuses. And there are pros and cons to basically having this form of sexual relationships. One of the pros is that there's very low emotional investment. That means that you don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about the feelings of the other person, or trying to be in contact with them, or trying to prove that you're worthy of their affection. It can also be less threatening. You don't have to ask anyone out. You don't have to have it be known that you're a couple. It can be good for men in the sense that it can bolster their sexual reputation in terms of how many people they've hooked up with and who those people were. But conversely, it can be bad for women because it might damage their relationship in terms of how many people they've hooked up with and who they were. So hookup culture can be very complex. And of course, it does have a lot of negatives. There's a higher risk of STIs the more people you hook up with. For some people, the lack of emotional connection is really damaging. So even though it's a very prevalent part of young adulthood these days, it's kind of a recent invention, and it's not something that previous generations did, and it might not be something that future generations do. So this is one of the things that probably seems normal to you right now, but might seem weird to future generations. Next, we come to dating. And dating is also a very nebulous word. Can you be dating more than one person at a time? Could you go out with multiple people on the same weekend? If you are dating, are you serious, or is dating the beginning phase where you're not serious at all? This is another one of our sort of complex social issues. This is one of the reasons you have to be very clear with your romantic and sexual partners, because there's no way of guessing what they think dating means, for instance. It's also interesting that people choose sometimes to go on dates with 2 people and sometimes to go on a big group date with a whole herd of people. So some people are kind of threatened by the very idea of going on a 2-person date. It can be so formal. You might have to dress up. You only talk to that person the whole time. Sometimes it's more comfortable to go on a group date. Your friends are all there. There's a lot of padding in case things get awkward. But this is another example of how it's hard to tell how serious a relationship is if you're going on group dates versus 2-person dates. And it's also interesting in what order the casual relationships happen. It used to be that people would go on dates and then become sexual. But very often these days, people are sexual, and then if they like that, they go on dates. So whether the sex or the feelings come first is a very modern question. Next, let's talk about cohabitation. So in this sense, we're talking about cohabitation as 2 romantic sexual partners, but not married, living in the same house. So cohabitation used to be kind of forbidden. Everybody who lived together was supposed to be already married, but it's becoming increasingly popular, especially among younger people. So if we look at some graphs, in this first graph, you'll notice that it's actually more common for young people to have cohabitated than it is for them to have been married at this point in history. So you can see here that about 60% of people in 2002 had ever been married, but in 2017, almost 60% of people had ever cohabitated. This is in part because marriage is on the decline, but it is also in part because cohabitation is on the rise. In this graph, you can see that this has changed steadily over the course of time. So the red line indicates people who lived with their spouse from age 25 to 34, and you'll notice that in the late 60s and early 70s that was very common, but it's dropped by almost half. And in fact, it's become much more common to live with a partner to whom you are not married. In this graph, we're measuring whether people think that's even okay. And again, you'll notice that over the course of time, it does change. In the 90s, more people agreed that it was wrong for a couple to live together, but by 2012, more people agreed that it was okay for a couple to live together. So our norms about when you are supposed to move in with your significant other have been changing rapidly over the last couple of decades, and a lot of that has to do with marriage. And that brings us to marriage. Marriage is often considered the most serious relationship of all. So there are lots of reasons that people get married. Historically, people got married for very practical reasons. They needed a life partner, they needed a parent for their children. Also, people tend to get married for religious reasons. Many religions preach that marriage is the ultimate goal for each individual person. Also, a lot of religions preach that you should only have sex within marriage or only have children within marriage. So it is very commonly done for specifically religious reasons. Some people get married for practical social reasons. Sometimes it can raise your social status, and it can be an important way to gain wealth or prestige. And of course, sometimes people get married because they love each other, and they just feel like it. There are tax breaks, of course, but it's also considered very socially common to get married in America. Most Americans get married at least once. So very often people get married because they feel like they're supposed to, or because it is kind of nice to have a life partner. However, the rate at which people get married in America is changing very rapidly. So let's look at a few graphs. First, we have this graph that tells us the marital status of the US population from 1960 to 2016. And what I'd like for you to notice here is that the percentage of people who are married is dropping pretty rapidly. The percentage of people who were never married is of course rising, and the percentage of people who are divorced is also rising. So not only is it common to get married but then get divorced, it's becoming increasingly common not to get married in the first place. In this next graph, we can see that part of the reason that Americans are not married quite as often as usual is that they're getting married later. So especially as women continue to get higher educations, they're waiting until after they finish college, sometimes until after they finish their higher degrees to get married. So in the 50s, the average age at marriage used to be about 22 for men and 20 for women. But these days, the average age of marriage is inching closer and closer to 30. It's close to 30 for men and about 28 for women. So the fact that people are getting married at an older age has a lot to do with why a smaller percentage of the population is married. In this next graph, you can see that the age at which people get married does vary around the world. So the United States is kind of here in the middle, but in some places, people are still regularly married in their early 20s, and in some places they wait until well into their mid-30s. So there are a lot of reasons for the decline in marriage rates. But like so many other things, what can seem like a deeply personal choice often has to do with bigger social implications. So for instance, in previous generations, women had to get married to be economically stable. They couldn't work outside the home, they couldn't have bank accounts, or really even own their own homes. But these days, if a woman wants to leave her parents' house, she can work, she can save money, she can live all by herself. So it's no longer economically necessary to tie yourself to a marriage. Also, people are becoming less and less religious. In America, religiosity, which is how we measure how strongly religious people are, has been on the decline for decades. So as more and more people leave the church, more and more people decide they don't need to be married at all. It's also becoming a little bit more socially acceptable to not be married. It used to be extremely unusual to be a person who was not married. It used to be a position kind of for outcasts because marriage was considered an important part of adulthood. But these days, a lot of people are happily single. It doesn't mean that they don't have a family or that they don't have friends. It just means that they're not legally married. They might even have a life partner, but just not be legally married to them. So the decline in marriage has a lot to do with our changing social norms, with our changing financial norms and religious norms. And so even though you might not want to get married to that person specifically, whether or not you want to get married, period, is up to you. Next, let's talk about fidelity and infidelity. This is a very serious topic for a lot of people, because no matter how hard we pretend that we don't have any feelings and we're really hard, we're all very soft and fluffy inside. So if fidelity is important to you, that's okay. Let it be important to you. If it's not, that's okay. Tell your partners that it's not. But it is still a very touchy subject because most of our stories involve fidelity, sometimes infidelity, and this is something we really like to talk about. So first, let's talk about the very concept of monogamy. So monogamy is the idea that each person has one other partner. There are only two people in any given relationship, and that includes both sex and feelings. Well, one thing that's interesting about monogamy is that it's not really that common worldwide, and it's not really that common over the course of history. We know that people have been practicing monogamy for at least 20,000 years, but we also know that really only about 20% of societies, historically and worldwide, practice monogamy. Other forms of sexual and emotional relationships are much more common, including some of the ones that we'll talk about next. But in America, we talk a lot about monogamy. Are we actually monogamous is a separate question. So I do, of course, have some graphs. In this first graph, we're looking at views on extramarital sex. For instance, do you think extramarital sex is always wrong, or almost always, or perhaps not wrong at all? And you'll notice that the vast majority of people say that it's always wrong, or at the very least, almost always wrong. But, you guessed it, in the next graph, we're looking at instances of extramarital sex. So basically, even though people always say that it's wrong or that it's almost always wrong, you'll notice that a pretty good amount of people still have extramarital sex. So even though we talk a lot about monogamy, we don't necessarily do monogamy. And there are some good reasons to do monogamy. There are the social reasons. We expect this out of people very often, and it's embarrassing if our partner cheats on us. There are the biological reasons. We like to know who the father is of any given baby, and one way to achieve that is monogamy. But the fact that monogamy is so commonly taught and yet so commonly not practiced is one of the really interesting things about sexual mores in America. Monogamy is not the only option, of course. There are lots and lots of ways to be non-monogamous. So the thing that's kind of interesting about non-monogamous relationships is that they can be done ethically or they can be done unethically. So if we look at this graph, I think it helps to explain some of the ways that you could have a non-monogamous relationship. You can see that it can range from just having sex with strangers to swinging with your partner. Swinging is when you and your partner have sex with other people, but usually together. It could range to friends with benefits, all the way up to polyamory. So there are lots of different ways to be non-monogamous, and some of them are really very ethical because you talked about it with your partner first and you went into it intentionally. Some of them are not ethical at all, like cheating. So basically, if you find yourself to be a non-monogamous person, you need to use your words and tell your partners about that. You can be totally happy non-monogamous, you just have to talk about it. So let's look at some examples of ways that people can practice non-monogamy. In this first one, we're looking at polygamy. Now, polygamy is an ancient practice. Lots and lots of different cultures practice polygamy. And polygamy is when one man has multiple wives. So you might have seen this, for instance, in the Mormon Church. There's Warren Jeffs with his range of wives, many of whom were underage, he went to jail, don't recommend. Or this man who has a show about how many wives that he has. They seem okay, at least they're all adults. But polygamy is very often practiced by very powerful and wealthy men, adding more and more wives to the chain as a way of demonstrating their power and their wealth and their sexual prowess. So we see it pretty commonly among like kings and emperors and other kinds of tribal leaders. It's less common to practice polyandry. Polyandry is when one woman has multiple husbands. And again, we don't see this very commonly. It is practiced in some cultures where women are sort of at a shortage, or in some cultures where land is at a shortage, such as these people in Nepal, where it's relatively common for families to marry one woman. Each brother marries the same woman, and then all of the children are just considered everyone's children. It's also becoming increasingly common in Western cultures as a matter of choice. You could also not marry anybody, but be polyamorous. So polyamory means that you love, or at least you want to love, multiple people at the same time. And the idea with polyamory is that it's not necessarily a marriage act, and it's not necessarily 3 or 5 or 20 people. It's as many relationships as you want, openly and ethically. So you may have heard a lot about polyamory lately because it's kind of catching on among the young set, especially in bigger cities. And this is an interesting way to think about monogamy in terms of sexual relationships and what we expect out of our serious emotional connections. Sometimes non-monogamy can take a slightly darker turn, such as being on the down low. So the down low is basically when people have sexual relationships that are kept secret. And generally speaking, it's men who are having sexual relationships with men, and especially commonly non-white men. This is a very sociological issue because basically in some cultures and in some societies, homosexual relationships are still unacceptable. So men who want to engage in homosexual sex, or really even in homosexual affection, aren't supposed to do that, so they have to keep it a secret. So this is surprisingly common, but of course it has to be kept a secret because it's socially unacceptable. So this is another really interesting way of measuring how society feels about certain relationships, and when, for instance, these relationships are acceptable and when they are not. So being on the down low is hopefully becoming a little bit less common as American culture becomes more accepting, but it is still worth considering the racial and ethnic implications of why a relationship might need to be kept secret. So those are all of the somewhat normal kinds of sexual relationships, and next we're going to talk about the deviant ones. So deviance is a really fun thing to talk about in sociology because we are constantly changing our minds about what is deviant and who is deviant and how bad something really is. So here is a pretty good definition. Deviance is the fact or state of departing from usual or accepted standards, especially in social or sexual behavior. So the thing that's important here is that not only do we not know what's normal, we also don't know what's deviant. We basically make it up as we go, and it has a lot to do with power and who is saying what's deviant and who is saying what's normal. So what we're going to do is look at a couple of different kinds of sexual relationships and talk about how sometimes they used to be deviant, sometimes they still are, and how we decide which ones are good and which ones are bad. So next, let's talk about race and sexuality. This is a very tricky topic because Americans are very concerned with race. We are making it up. As you've hopefully learned in your sociology classes, race is largely a social construct, but that doesn't mean that we're not very concerned about it. So there is a whole word for racial mixing in terms of marriage and sexual relationships, and that word is miscegenation. And hopefully you haven't really heard that word lately, in part because we're caring about it less and less with every passing day, but also in part because it's no longer illegal. So to sleep with or marry someone of another race used to be illegal in America, and it was also illegal in Nazi Germany and in apartheid South Africa, and you can pretty much tell you're doing something wrong if you're doing something that was common in Nazi Germany or apartheid South Africa, just as a general rule. But miscegenation wasn't made illegal in America until relatively recently. So if we look at this map, you can see when in each state it was made legal. In a lot of these dark red states, which you'll notice are the Bible Belt, it was only legalized by a Supreme Court decision in 1967. In other states, it was legal far before that. But it has long been something that we consider scary. If you look at these pictures, you'll notice on the left that this is a poster about how miscegenation will increase now that President Lincoln has been elected again. Basically, people were concerned that ex-slaves would marry white women. And the same concern lasted way up until the 60s, when the busing program began bringing black students to predominantly white schools. There was once again a concern that black men would start dating white women. You might be noticing a theme here. But the way that we finally got rid of the laws against miscegenation was a Supreme Court case in 1967. And it was called Loving versus Virginia, because the family at the center of this case was the Loving family. So there they are. They're adorable, and basically I'll put a video up so that you can see their whole story. But they were married in Virginia, and they didn't know that they weren't allowed to be married because technically she was black and he was white. When the Virginia police decided that they had such a problem with this that they busted into their house in the middle of the night, dragged them out of bed and to jail, they realized that their marriage was illegal. So they took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. And finally, in 1967, the Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't make it illegal for people of different races to marry each other, and that in fact, anybody of any race could marry anybody else of any other race. So this was a big social change. And the thing that I want to highlight here is that it was not necessarily a popular social change. You guessed it, more graphs. In this first graph, we're measuring the rise of interracial marriage in America. So as you can see, since 1967, it's been on a very steady incline. It's gone from 3 to 17% among newlyweds, and it ranges at about 10% for everybody else. It's especially common to marry somebody of a different race if you live in a place that's ethnically diverse. So in this map, you can see how common it is for people to be in interracial marriages with someone of Hispanic origin. You'll notice it's much more common in the West and in the Southwest and in Florida, which is, of course, where there are more people of Hispanic origin. So the likelihood of you marrying someone of a different race has a lot to do with the likelihood of you knowing someone of a different race. Whether or not we are okay with interracial marriage has changed really rapidly over the course of the last few decades. So in this next graph, you can see on the left that they're asking people if interracial marriage is good for society, if it's bad, or if it doesn't make much of a difference. You'll notice that the amount of people who say it's good has gone up, who say it's bad has gone down, and who say it doesn't make much of a difference has leveled out. On the right, we have a much more upsetting graph, in which basically they're measuring whether you would be upset if one of your relatives was marrying somebody of each one of these races. You'll notice that basically the racism has dropped, but it's still very, very real. In the 90s, it was much worse, for instance, for black people to be marrying into non-black families because clearly people were not okay with that. It has dropped from 63% to 14%, which is progress, but you can still see that generally speaking, people don't like it when their relatives marry non-white people. This is actually pretty common among all races. In this next graph, we're looking at the likelihood of being married to somebody of your race versus a different race. And this graph is from the 2010 census. And you can see, if you make a diagonal line from top left to bottom right, that most of the time Americans marry somebody of their own race. But you can also see that it's increasingly common to have certain matchups, but not other ones. For instance, white men are especially prevalent in terms of marrying people outside of their race, as are white women. In part, this has to do, of course, with the fact that there just are more white people in America right now than any other race, but it also has to do with the fact that white people have a certain privilege when it comes to making choices that might not be socially popular. So you can see here, for instance, that black men almost exclusively marry black women. In these next graphs, you can see that one of the reasons that interracial marriage is changing and becoming more acceptable is because millennials are basically fine with it. On the left, they're measuring whether millennials would be okay with a family member marrying somebody from each of these groups. You can see that there is still a lot of racial bias, and the sense that Asian Americans, who are considered the model minority, are the most acceptable, and Black Americans are the least acceptable. On the right, they're measuring levels of support for interracial marriage, not just with millennials, but also among race. And again, you'll notice that people get more accepting of interracial marriage the younger they are and less accepting the older they are. But for all their talk, millennials are not okay with everything. In this next graph, we measure what they actually do. So in this graph, we're looking at data from OkCupid, which is an online dating site. And what they're measuring is whether women respond to men of different races and whether men respond to women of different races. And you'll notice that the highest response rates do tend to be within your own race or towards white men, whereas the lowest response rates do tend to be for black men. The same thing is shown for men contacting women, although it's much more severe there, and for men responding to women, although again, it's a little bit more severe there. So even though people say that they're okay with something, what they actually do can be a different question. The final interesting thing about the very concept of interracial marriage is that our concept of race itself is changing. The racial demographics in America are beginning to change really rapidly, in part because of interracial marriage, but in part because people are starting to identify differently. So for instance, in this graph, you can see that in 2015, America was still majority white. But the census predicts that by 2045, America will be about half white, but there will be large gains in other segments of racial identity. For instance, they predict that we'll have more people of Hispanic identity, and of course more people who consider themselves mixed or other or two or more races. So as our definitions of who is what race become more and more loosely defined, so too will our definition of interracial marriage. So it might not matter nearly as much in the future as people think it matters right now. Next, let's talk about age and sexuality. Sexuality is a lifelong part of our human experience, but we still only think about a certain age range of people being sexually active. So for instance, how old should you be before you become sexually active? I think we can all agree that this baby should have nothing to do with that. But how old should you be when you start to experiment? How old should your partners be? These are very social questions. In America, we do have some legal recommendations. For instance, in this map, you can see the age of consent in every state. There's not too much variation. It pretty much goes from 16 to 18. But the very fact that it does range from state to state indicates that we have different norms in each state about how old we think people should be. If you look at a graph worldwide, you'll notice that there's a huge range in terms of how old we think people should be before they can give consent to be sexually active. In some places, it's less than 13. In some places, it doesn't matter because you have to be married anyway. But as you can see here, it does typically range between 16 and 18, much like it does in America, with a few places believing it to be a little bit lower and a few places believing it to be a little bit higher. One of the most important questions about how old you need to be to consent has to do with the difference in age between the partners. So in some places, the difference in age is vital. For instance, you may have heard of Romeo and Juliet clauses, which stipulate that if you are over the age of 18 and you have sex with someone under the age of 18, as long as you're within 3 or 4 years of each other, it's okay. But in other places, if you're any more than 3 or 4 years apart, it is strictly illegal. This is done to protect people who are young. Basically, people can be coerced and they can be trained and they can be taught that it's acceptable for them to be sexual before they're really able to consent. So often what we want to do here is protect the really young people. Some people think that we shouldn't. You may have heard of NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. They argue that it's perfectly acceptable for a young man to have an older adult man as a sexual partner. We generally are not okay with this in America, but historically there have been cultures that have practiced this. One of the interesting things about our thoughts on the difference between the age of sex partners has to do with gender. So even if both partners are adults, we find it pretty acceptable when an older man has sex with younger women, but we're still a little bit confused by the concept of an older woman having sex with younger men. There's a whole word for it. You've probably heard of people being called cougars. But the very fact that we don't really have a word for when an older man has sex with a younger woman is a great indication of how it's socially acceptable. So you can be pretty far apart in age once you are adults, but that doesn't mean that people won't frown at you and make jokes about you, and possibly even dedicate whole movies to your adventure. The final question about age has to do with how old is too old. And this is one of those questions that you should probably revisit over the course of your own life, because generally speaking, we don't like to think about older people having sex, but when you are older, I bet you will want to. So this is one of those things that we don't have a top limit for. We have a bottom limit for age of consent, but there is no legal top limit in terms of how old you can be before you can legally stop having sex. So we know that older people are increasingly sexually active, thanks in part to Viagra, but also thanks in part to loosening sexual norms. So the age at which people stop having sex is pretty much exclusively up to them and usually their physical limitations. Again, you might not like this thought right now, but we'll ask you again when you're 85. So our final topic in regard to deviance and sexuality is kink. And this is another loosely defined aspect of sexuality. Basically, a useful definition is this: the use of non-conventional sexual practices, concepts, or fantasies. But once again, we're stuck with that question: what does non-conventional mean? How extreme does something need to be before it's non-conventional? How does what's conventional change over the course of time? How might the publication of one series of books change our ideas of kink forever? So what we're going to do is go through a couple different aspects of kinky sexuality and talk about how extreme each one has to be before we think it's problematic. So you've probably heard the acronym BDSM. What we're going to do is go through each of those letters in turn. So first, the B, bondage. And bondage is when you tie or restrain somebody as part of the sexual act. And the thing that's interesting about bondage, and really about most of these acts, is that there's sort of a top-level concern and then a much deeper thing happening. So the top-level concern is the tying up, the bondage. The deeper thing is the exchange of power and control. So with bondage, basically, one person loses power and one person gains power. But assuming that this is done consensually, and all of this should always be done consensually, this can be very pleasant. A lot of people like this very much. And like all of the other acts we're going to talk about today, there's a huge range of ways that you can partake in this kind of behavior. So it can range from something pretty gentle, like tying somebody up with a necktie, to pretty severe, like putting somebody in a full-body latex suit. So one of the things that's really interesting about kink itself, especially in American culture, is how many stops along the way there are in terms of the level at which you want to partake in something like this. Next, we'll talk about the D, discipline. And discipline on its surface is about punishing someone. But discipline under the surface is essentially about submission and dominance. It's about who gets to do the punishing, it's about who has to suffer the punishing, and it has a lot to do with control, in terms of one person choosing how to discipline the other person. Again, a huge range of behaviors. You may have seen something like a wedding cake topper, where the bride has the groom on a leash, but that's a pretty light version. A more heavy version is a total leather dog suit, where the person gets walked around on a leash. So discipline can also have a huge range of behaviors involved, and often it's about the reward. Next, we come to the S and the M, which stand for sadism and masochism. So sadism is when you take pleasure in inflicting pain upon someone else, and masochism is when you take pleasure in receiving pain. And this is interesting because it's clearly two sides of the same coin. You need two people who enjoy opposite things to do this successfully. So again, there's a huge range. It could go from gently spanking somebody in a sexy way to suspending somebody via hooks in their flesh. So one of the things that's really important about sadism and masochism, and really about all of these kinks, is open communication with your partner. Because, for instance, how much pain you want inflicted upon you is very personal, and it can change rapidly. Or how much control you're prepared to give up can change very rapidly and be dependent on the partner. So open communication is extremely important if you're going to engage in any one of these activities. Another really common way to enjoy kink is role-playing. So the idea with role-playing is that one or both of you are taking the role of the other. It's a way of sort of introducing a stranger or a different kind of behavior, or just sort of playing at something that wouldn't be normal for you. Sometimes just the break from the normal is the excitement. As with all of the other activities, there's a huge range, from the sort of basic sexy maid to people who want to live as babies. So role-playing can be something that happens once, it can be something that happens all day, every day, and again, communication is always key. This is one of the sort of entry points often for kink. You probably know somebody who's done this, you might have done this yourself. Again, our definition of what is normal changes really rapidly. One of the main reasons that BDSM and kink generally are becoming more acceptable in American culture is because they've been sort of inching their way into the mainstream. By which I mean that you can see evidence of other people partaking in BDSM, or you can see things that might inspire you to partake in kinky activities almost everywhere these days. You might see it on the cover of magazines. You might see it in music videos. And it is important to recognize that the book series 50 Shades of Grey kind of changed the game. I want to be clear that it's a terrible book series. It's poorly written, and a lot of what they do happens without consent, which is totally unacceptable. But it was a huge bestseller, and that's important to note. Basically, a lot of people who might not otherwise have read something like that, or even thought about something like that, were exposed via this book series. In this graph, you can see that the searches on Pornhub changed very dramatically right after this movie came out. You can see that BDSM and submission and chains and rope all had a massive uprise in terms of who was looking for those things online. So even though we often don't talk about these things out loud or in polite situations, we are increasingly beginning to talk about sex generally and beginning to talk about more kinky elements of sex openly in American culture. So our final questions for the day circle all the way back around to the beginning, which is questioning what is normal. How do we know what's normal? How do we know if what we're doing is normal? Should we feel obligated to be normal? Should we feel guilty if we're doing something that isn't normal? And of course, how does this change over time? These are all giant open-ended questions, but I am looking forward to hearing about your thoughts. As always, if you have any questions, please send me an email, and I'll see you next time.